Ethan had always believed that silence was not dangerous, just uncomfortable. But over the past few months, the silence in his home had changed. It had become heavy, like something unseen was sitting between him and his wife, Lila, growing bigger each day. They still lived under the same roof, still shared meals, still said the usual small things, but something important was missing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, slow, and unsettling that morning. Ethan stood in the bedroom, folding the last of his clothes into a small travel bag. The trip was short, just 3 days for work, but it felt like more than that. It felt like an escape. Not because he wanted to run away from Lila, but because he didn't know how to reach her anymore. Every conversation felt forced. Every attempt to connect ended in polite words and empty smiles. Lila stood near the door watching him. She had been unusually quiet that morning. Normally, she would remind him of small things, his charger, his documents, his habit of forgetting his watch. But today, she said nothing. Her arms were folded tightly, as if she was holding herself together. Ethan glanced at her while zipping his bag. "It's just 3 days," he said, trying to sound normal. "I know," she replied, her voice soft but distant. He waited, expecting her to say more. But she didn't. That pause stretched longer than it should have. It made him uncomfortable. He picked up his bag and walked toward her. "I'll call you when I reach." Lila nodded, but her eyes didn't meet his. "Yeah, okay." Something about the way she said it felt wrong. Not sad, not worried, just distracted. As if her mind was somewhere else entirely. Ethan studied her face for a moment. There was a flicker of something in her expression. It was quick, almost invisible, but he caught it: nervousness. He frowned slightly. "Are you okay?" She forced a small smile. "I'm fine, just tired." He didn't fully believe her, but he didn't push. Lately, pushing only made things worse. She would shut down, give short answers, and walk away. He had learned to step back even when it felt wrong. "All right," he said quietly. He moved past her and walked out of the room, down the hallway, and toward the front door. Each step felt heavier than it should have. He couldn't explain why. It was just a simple trip. He had done this many times before, but today felt different. He opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was cool, and the street was calm. Everything looked normal. Peaceful, even. Yet his chest felt tight. He paused on the doorstep, his hand still on the door handle. Something was pulling at him. Not physically, but emotionally. A quiet voice inside him was telling him to stop. He ignored it at first. He walked down the small path leading to his car, placed his bag in the back seat, and got in. He started the engine but didn't move. His hands rested on the steering wheel. But his mind wasn't on the road. It was on Lila. On the way she looked at him, on the way she avoided his eyes, on the strange tension in her voice. Ethan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment. He tried to convince himself that he was over. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe he was imagining things. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. This feeling had been building for months. The late-night messages she would quickly hide. The way she smiled at her phone but not at him. The distance in her touch, the silence in her words. He had ignored all of it, hoping it would pass. But it hadn't. It had grown. And now, sitting in his car, about to leave, it felt unbearable. He opened his eyes and stared at the house. What if something was really wrong? What if leaving now meant missing something important? Or worse, what if leaving made things worse? His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He let out a slow breath. Then suddenly made a decision. He turned off the engine. The quiet returned. Instantly, without giving himself time to think again, he stepped out of the car, grabbed nothing, and walked back toward the house. Each step felt faster than the last. His heart was beating harder now, not from fear, but from urgency. He reached the door and paused. For a second, then he opened it. The house was quiet, too quiet. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Gently, Lila." He called out. No answer. He walked further in, his eyes scanning the living room. Everything looked normal. Nothing out of place. But the silence felt different now. He took a few more steps and then stopped. There she was, standing in the middle of the room. Her back was slightly turned toward him, and her posture was stiff. She looked like she had been caught in the middle of something. Though he couldn't tell what, Ethan spoke calmly, but his voice carried weight. "I didn't leave." Leela turned around quickly. The moment their eyes met, everything changed. Her face went pale. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. And for a brief, undeniable moment, panic flashed across her. Eyes dotted. Wasn't confusion, it wasn't surprise, it was fear. Ethan saw it, clearly, and it hit him harder than anything else could have. "I said the trip was canceled," he continued, his tone steady. Lila blinked rapidly, as if trying to recover. "Why, you're back already?" "I never left." The room felt frozen. Lila tried to smile, but it looked forced, almost fragile. "That's unexpected." Ethan took a step closer, watching her carefully. She didn't answer immediately. Her hands moved slightly, as if she didn't know what to do with them. She looked around for a second, avoiding his gaze again. That was all the confirmation he needed. Something was wrong. Something she wasn't telling him, and she hadn't expected him to come back. Ethan felt a sharp ache in his chest, but he kept his face calm. "What were you doing?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied quickly. Too quickly. Ethan noticed he always noticed. The problem was, he used to ignore it, but not anymore. He glanced around the room again, searching for anything unusual. There was nothing obvious. No signs, no clues. Just her and her reaction. That was enough. "You look nervous," he said quietly. "I'm not," she replied. But her voice didn't match her words. He stepped closer again, closing the distance between them. "Then why do you seem like you didn't want me to come back?" That question hung in the air. Lila finally looked at him, but her eyes were filled with something he hadn't seen before. Guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Ethan's heart sank. This wasn't just distance. This wasn't just stress. This was something deeper, something real. And whatever it was, it had been hidden from him for a long time. Ethan straightened slightly, his mind racing, but his body still. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. He didn't want to assume the worst, but he couldn't ignore what he just seen. That moment of panic, that instant reaction, it told him more than words ever could. "I didn't plan to come back," he admitted, "but something didn't feel right." Lila stayed silent. "I think you know that," he added. Her eyes lowered again, and that silence, that quiet, heavy silence said everything. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to keep control of his emotions. He wasn't angry yet. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't accusing, but inside, something was shifting. Something important. Trust. It wasn't broken yet, but it was no longer steady. And as he stood there, watching his wife struggle to meet his eyes, one thought became clear in his mind. This moment wasn't just about a canceled trip. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something he could no longer ignore. Leela's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in as if they could hear the unspoken tension between them. Ethan's calm presence made it worse, in a way he didn't intend. He wasn't angry yet, but his eyes carried a quiet weight that made her heart pound. She wanted to speak, to explain, to reach out, but her throat felt tight, as if words would betray her before she was ready. Ethan took a step closer. The sound of his shoes on the hardwood floor echoed in the quiet room, each step measured and deliberate. "Is this about him?" he asked softly, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through her hesitance. Lila flinched slightly, caught off guard by the directness. She had been rehearsing her excuses, rehearsing half-truths. But now, faced with his steady gaze, they all seemed useless. "No," she said quickly, almost too quickly. Her voice trembled despite her attempt to sound firm. She could feel her own pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to hide, to run, to explain in a way that would make sense, but the words just tangled in her throat. Ethan's presence was like a mirror, reflecting all the lies she had been telling herself and the half-truths she had been living with. Ethan didn't move. He waited, giving her space, but not too much space. There was a tension in the air that refused to be ignored, a charge that made it impossible for either of them to take a breath without feeling the weight of the other. He could see the guilt flicker across her face, small but unmistakable. It was like a shadow she couldn't hide, no matter how hard she tried. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered, finally letting some of the truth slip. Her hands gripped the edges of her shirt, twisting the fabric in her fingers. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to ruin what we have." Her eyes were filled with a quiet desperation, a pleading that made Ethan's chest tighten. He had felt the distance growing for months, had felt her slipping through his fingers, but hearing the words now made it real, undeniable. Ethan's expression softened slightly, but the ache in his chest remained. He took another step closer, careful not to overwhelm her. "Why now?" he asked quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of months of uncertainty, months of feeling invisible in his own home. Lila looked down, unable to meet his eyes. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "I didn't want to lose you," she admitted after a pause, her voice breaking. "Not completely. Not to him, but I got confused. I didn't know what I wanted. And then when you said you didn't leave, I panicked." The words came out in a rush, spilling over each other, raw and unfiltered. Ethan listened, absorbing every syllable, every hesitation, every flicker of fear and regret in her eyes. He wanted to say something, to reassure her, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But the words didn't come easily. He had waited too long to confront this. He had watched her drift away, had felt her slipping out of reach. And now he had to navigate this delicate space between hurt and hope. His hand twitched slightly, the instinct to reach out strong, but he held back. He wanted her to see him, to really see him, not just as someone standing there, but as someone who had noticed everything, felt everything, and still wanted to understand. Lila's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. She tried to blink them away, tried to keep control, but they came anyway, hot and heavy, running down her cheeks. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply watched, steady and patient, letting her emotions unfold without interruption. There was something intimate in the way he gave her that space, something that reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. "I thought maybe it was too late," she continued, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Maybe you had already moved on in your own way. Maybe I had already lost you." She looked up at him then, her eyes wide, vulnerable, desperate. Ethan could see the truth in her gaze, the regret, the longing, the fear of losing something precious that had been right in front of her all along. Ethan stepped closer, closing some of the distance without overwhelming her. "You don't lose people that easily," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had felt over the past months. "But you do make me wonder. When you say things like that, what were you thinking? What were you feeling?" His eyes searched hers, steady and patient, demanding honesty without forcing it. Lila swallowed hard. She tried to speak, but the words stumbled. I felt trapped," she admitted finally. "Trapped by my own choices, by my own mistakes. I didn't know how to fix things, so I just ran in my head. I imagined leaving, imagining someone else, but it was never real. Not really. It was just a way to cope with my fear." Ethan nodded slowly, listening. He could feel the weight of her words pressing against him, the raw honesty, the vulnerability. It was enough to shake him, enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about their relationship. But it was also a start. It was a thread they could hold on to, fragile as it was, and try to rebuild something real. "You scared me," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but low. "You think I wouldn't notice, or that I wouldn't care? But I do. I always notice. I always care. And when you shut me out like that, it hurts in ways I can't even describe." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion, but not with anger. There was no shouting, no accusation, just the raw truth of someone who had felt the slow erosion of closeness and had watched. Helplessly, Lila's shoulders shook, and she pressed her hands to her face, trying to hide her tears. But Ethan gently moved closer and lowered his voice. "You don't have to hide from me. I don't want you to. I want the truth, all of it, even the messy parts." She looked up, meeting his eyes fully for the first time in months. There was fear there, yes, but also relief. Relief that he still wanted her, relief that he hadn't given up, relief that they might have a chance to fix the damage that had been done. "I don't want anyone else," she said finally, the words trembling but clear. "I don't want him. I just want us, if that's even possible." Ethan's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the moment, the fragile thread they were both standing on. He wanted to reach out, to close the distance completely, to let her know that they could survive this, but he held back. He wanted her to understand that rebuilding trust wasn't instantaneous. It required patience, honesty, and effort from both sides. "We can try," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "We can try, but it won't be perfect. It won't be easy. But if we're honest with each other, maybe we can find our way back." Lila nodded, tears still streaming, but a small flicker of hope in her eyes. She had been lost, scared, and confused, but now she could see a path forward. A path that didn't involve running or hiding, but facing everything honestly, together. The room seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight of unspoken words had begun to lift. Silence returned, but it was different, now soft, tentative, and filled with possibility. They didn't speak for a few moments, just letting the quiet settle around them. Each breath, each heartbeat was a reminder that they were still here, still together. Still willing to try, Ethan finally broke the silence. "We'll need time," he said. "Time to rebuild. Time to trust. Time to remember what brought us together in the first place." Kayla nodded again, a small, fragile smile appearing through her tears. "I'll try," she whispered. Ethan reached out, just enough to touch her hand lightly. Not to pull her close, not yet, but enough to remind her that he was there, steady and unwavering. She let him touch her, letting herself feel the warmth of his presence, stability he offered. They stood there, close but not too close, letting the moment exist without rushing it. Both of them knew that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. There would be doubts, arguments, fears, and setbacks. But they also knew that they wanted the same thing, each other, honestly. Without pretense or hiding, the afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. It was as if the world outside was giving them a moment to breathe, to pause, to gather themselves before stepping into the unknown future. Leela finally spoke again, her voice quieter, steadier. "Thank you for not leaving." "Ta." Ethan nodded, a small, soft smile forming on his lips. "I'm not done with us yet, not while there's still hope." Her heart fluttered at his words. It was a simple statement, but it carried a depth of meaning she hadn't heard in a long time. For the first time in months, she felt seen, understood, and valued. The panic that had flashed in her eyes earlier had softened into something else, something hopeful, fragile, and real. They didn't rush to fill the space between them, didn't try to force reconciliation in that instant. Instead, they allowed the quiet to speak, the understanding to settle, and the emotions to breathe. It was a delicate beginning, a tentative first step toward rebuilding what had been strained. And as they stood there, in that small, quiet room, both of them understood the unspoken truth. Healing was possible, but only if they faced it together, honestly. And without fear, the chapter of panic and fear had ended, but a new chapter, full of fragile hope and the promise of reconciliation, had just begun. Ethan stood still, watching Lila as she struggled with the weight of her own confession. The room was quiet, but the silence was thick with tension. He could see every flicker of emotion in her eyes, the fear, the guilt, the longing. It was all there, unspoken, raw, and impossible to ignore. He felt the ache in his chest, the same ache that had grown over the months of distance and misunderstanding. But he also felt something else, a flicker of hope, fragile and fleeting, that maybe they could survive this. He took a slow step forward, careful not to overwhelm her, careful not to push too far too fast. "Why now?" he asked quietly, his voice steady, but his eyes searching hers for truth. Lila swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. She had rehearsed explanations, half-truths, and excuses, but none of them seemed adequate now that he was standing there, calm yet attentive, waiting for honesty. "Because when you said you didn't leave, I panicked," she admitted, her voice trembling. Her eyes filled with tears she had tried to hold back, but they spilled over anyway. Ethan noticed how her hands shook, how her shoulders tensed. He could see that this was more than a simple confession, it was a moment of reckoning. A truth she had avoided for months, and now it was impossible to hide. He remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. Silence had a strange power, he realized. And right now it allowed her to face the consequences of her actions. To confront the fear that had driven her toward someone else, even if it had only been in thought. He could feel the tension in the room, the pull of something fragile and delicate, as if they were both standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure if they could trust each other again. "I didn't want to hurt you," she continued after a pause, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't want to lose you, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I thought maybe it wouldn't matter if I drifted away, if I pretended. If I tried to imagine something else for a moment." She broke off, her lips trembling. Her eyes were wet, vulnerable, and Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. He had felt her slipping away for months, and now the truth was laid bare before him. Raw and undeniable. Ethan's mind raced, trying to absorb every word, every nuance, every flicker of regret in her expression. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that they could fix this. But he also knew that words alone would not heal what had been broken. Trust had been strained, closeness had been lost, and they both had to navigate this delicate space between hurt and hope. He stepped closer, just enough to close some of the physical distance, but he let her maintain control. "Do you still want him?" he asked, finally breaking the quiet. His voice was calm, but his heart pounded with anticipation. He needed to know, needed clarity, because without it, nothing could move forward. Leela shook her head immediately, as if afraid that hesitation would betray her. "No," she said softly but firmly. "I want us. If there's still an us left." The words struck him with a mix of relief and caution. Relief that she had chosen to be honest, that she had realized the depth of what they had. But caution because they both knew that honesty alone was not enough. Rebuilding what had been strained would take more than words. It would take patience, effort, a willingness to confront the mistakes and fears that had led them to this point. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave his body in small increments. He could feel the weight of the past months, the worry, the distance, the uncertainty, all pressing against him. But now there was a thread to hold on to, fragile but real. "Then we don't fix this with words alone," he said. "We fix it with time, with truth, with effort from both of us." Lila nodded, stepping slightly closer, but still keeping a small distance. She was tentative, fragile, but willing to take that step. The tears on her face glistened in the soft light of the room, and Ethan could see the vulnerability she had been hiding. It was raw and real. And it reminded him of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. The strength beneath the fragility. The warmth beneath the hesitation. The honesty beneath the fear. For a few moments, they stood there in silence, letting the quiet settle around them. Each breath, each heartbeat was a reminder that they were still together, still present, still willing to face the uncertainty. Ethan realized that this was not the end of their story, nor was it a perfect resolution. It was a beginning, a fragile step toward rebuilding the trust and intimacy that had been strained. "You know it won't be easy," he said quietly. "There will be doubts, fears, moments of insecurity. But if we face them together, honestly, maybe we can come out stronger." Lila's lips trembled into a small smile, a fragile but hopeful expression. "I'll try," she whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes." Her words carried a sincerity that Ethan recognized this was not just a promise to him, but a promise to herself to confront her fears, to embrace honesty. To rebuild what had been damaged, Ethan extended his hand, letting it hover near hers without touching yet. It was an invitation, a signal that he was present, steady, and willing to meet her halfway. Lila hesitated, then allowed her hand to brush his lightly. The touch was tentative, a small but significant gesture of trust, signaling that she was ready to begin, even if the road ahead was uncertain. They didn't rush into reconciliation, didn't force the moment into something it wasn't. They allowed the space between them to exist, to breathe, to be filled with tentative hope. Each step forward would have to be deliberate, conscious, and mutual. Ethan understood that the delicate thread they were holding was stronger than words, stronger than fear, because it was built on the foundation of what they had shared, loved, and survived together. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, bathing the room in a warm glow. It was a subtle reminder that life moved forward, that moments could change, that pain could transform into something meaningful if approached with care and honesty. Leela felt the warmth on her skin and realized that even in the shadow of mistakes, there was still light. There was still a chance to heal, to reconnect, to love intentionally and without pretense. Ethan's eyes softened as he studied her face, noting every detail, the lingering hesitation, the traces of tears, the flicker of hope. He felt the familiar pull of affection, of desire to protect, nurture, and reconnect. But he restrained himself, knowing that rushing would undo the fragile progress they had made. Instead, he simply allowed his presence to convey what words could not: steadiness, patience, and unwavering attention. Lila took a deep breath, letting the tension leave her body in a small, controlled exhale. She felt the ache of regret, yes, but also the stirring of something new, a possibility, a path forward, a chance to reclaim what she had almost lost. She realized that fear had driven her, but courage would guide her now. Courage to be honest, to face consequences, to embrace vulnerability, and to step toward the person she loved most with openness. Ethan finally spoke, breaking the silence with deliberate calm. "We will need time. Time to rebuild, to regain trust, to remember why we chose each other in the first place. But it's worth it if we're both willing." Leela's nod was slow but certain. She felt the weight of his words settle into her heart, grounding her, reminding her that love required patience and intention. She whispered, "I'm willing. I want to try. I want us." Ethan smiled faintly, a quiet expression that carried the depth of his emotions: relief, hope, determination, and affection. "Then we begin, one step at a time," he said. "No rushing, no pretending, just us. Honestly, fully together." The small gesture of honesty and presence created a space between them that was not filled with fear or regret, but with possibility. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And sometimes that fragile reality was all that mattered. They didn't embrace immediately, didn't fill the space with gestures meant to solve everything at once. Instead, they let the room be quiet, letting their hearts catch up with their minds. They allowed themselves to feel, to process, to understand that healing required patience and shared effort. As they stood together, even without words, both understood a profound truth. Love alone was not always enough, but honesty, vulnerability, and presence could give it a chance to thrive again. They knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time in months, the path did not feel impossible. Lila's eyes met Ethan's again, steady and sincere. "Thank you," she whispered softly, "for not giving up." Ethan's hand finally reached hers fully, their fingers intertwining lightly. It was a gentle touch, a small but significant gesture, a promise that neither would walk away, not while the thread of hope still existed. "We won't give up," he said quietly. "Not while we have each other." The afternoon light shifted slightly, casting shadows that danced across the floor, reflecting the fragility and movement of their emotions. It was a quiet, ordinary moment. But within it lay the beginning of rebuilding, the tentative return of trust. The first steps toward healing what had almost been lost. They stood there, hand in hand, neither speaking for a long while, letting the silence carry meaning, letting the connection breathe. Both of them understood that this was not the end of pain, nor the end of uncertainty. But it was a beginning, a delicate, hopeful, fragile beginning.